We will start today with talking about number crunching in DataGraph. As I was preparing for this webinar, I definitely kept thinking about the fact that spreadsheets are so prevalent in everything I think that people do related to data. And it is sort of interesting. I actually was looking at trying to find some good famous examples of where spreadsheet errors caused problems. And I guess I didn't pull together a specific list, but it is not hard to find papers out there and studies where people talk about spreadsheets and all these different errors that occur. And although DataGraph does, a lot of other things besides what we might think of doing in a spreadsheet, one thing I think is interesting is when I talk to people, even pretty avid users of the program, that spreadsheets still are something that people often use on a day-to-day basis. So the first thing that I would like to show you today is how you can have DataGraph be your default program to open up Excel files. To show you how to do this is pretty basic. So for example, here I have some spreadsheet files, but just in case you haven't done this before, because someone had to show me how to do this, if you take any file and you just right click on it, I'm sure you've done this before, you can specify what you want to open a file with. And here, for example, you'll notice that for Excel files and CSV files, and I think we may expand this for some other files as well that are already opened native, that DataGraph can open natively, you see DataGraph app as one of the options for opening this file. Now, the default on my computer right now is to open this in numbers. But if you want to change that, you can go into, I believe it's the Get Info. Yes, it is. And of course, it popped up on my other screen. Let's see if I can bring this back. So hopefully you can see this now. This is showing the Get Info for that file. And if you go into this, there's an Open With option here. And if you change that to DataGraph, and we can say use this application to open all documents like this one and say change all, then it's going to have every document with that file extension will be automatically opened within DataGraph. So now any of these files, if I want to open this up within DataGraph, I should just be able to double click, and sure enough, there it is. This is a file that was created in a spreadsheet. What you'll see is on the left-hand side, for every tab that was in this original spreadsheet, there's a group that's created. And this file has a lot of stuff in it. So there's a bunch of different groups. This is sort of a very typical spreadsheet from work that I've done when I was doing work in spreadsheets. But it's slightly different than if I took the file, and I can also do this if any of you haven't done this before. You can take any file that DataGraph can open and just drag it and drop it over onto the column list over here on the left. And when you do that, what it actually does is imports an overall group that then contains all of the tabs as groups underneath. So so that's slightly different. If I just open the file, it doesn't put the tabs in its own group. It just opens them all up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. We're not going to work with this file. Actually, this was just something to show you this. And the question came up, where can you find the data that I'm going to play with here? And if you just go to the example files, so file, online examples, within this interface is where I uploaded it. So you can just go to the first file that's in the list and click open, and there's some simple data sets that are contained there that we're going to go ahead and use. So let's just get started actually with a couple of these examples that I have set up here. This is in that file, and what you'll see are, I have 4 different groups that I pulled out just to show you some of the basics of how do you do this, so that even if you're really new with the program, this should help you to get started. So for the first example here, this is a group of data that has data on for different students, where each row, for example, would be a student, and there's quiz data, and there's test data, and there's a final exam. And I want to calculate the overall grade for these students and have the different, the quiz versus the test be weighted differently versus the final. So to do this, we use an expression column. So right off the bat, again, if you're new to the program, DataGraph does not use cell references. This is one of the reasons I think that we have often errors that happen in spreadsheets, because the equations are so difficult. If you just look at an equation that's in a spreadsheet, it's not very meaningful. So to do this here, the way that we would do this is to add an expression column, and there's a shortcut over here. Actually, I have this program I'm using, so I'm going to try and remember to do this. So here we have the function column. To create a function column, a shortcut to do that. You can also go under the data menu, and there's an add, actually really add expression column is what we refer to this. You could add functions, but it's called the expression column, or use the Command 3 shortcut. I find that to be an extremely handy thing to do. So if I go ahead then and want to add this column here, I'll just do Command 3. That adds my column. And you'll notice that it also adds the object over here on the left-hand side, where I can enter the actual expression that I'm going to calculate. And the way that we do this is we're going to use the names of the columns that we have in order to do this calculation. So here, for example, I would need to type my quiz plus my test 1. Now notice that anytime you have a name of a column with a space in it, then one of the things that you'll need to know is that to use it with the space, you will need to put quotations around those names. So you can leave the space if that's the way you want it. Oops, test 2, but you will, again, you have to put quotes around it. So I often do try to have my column names not have spaces in them for that reason, because if I'm going to do an equation, this is, it'll be easier. So again, this is just a very simple example for those of you who just might be getting started. So here I've just added together these columns. Now, think about how you do this in a spreadsheet. Well, in some ways it's pretty quick, right? Because you can say equal to, and then you say sum, and you just select the columns and pull them over. So just for a simple sum, that's pretty easy. But now if I want to weight each one of these, that technique doesn't work, right? I'd have to select each one and add the weight. So here, this is pretty easy to also add a weight. If I wanted my quiz grades, for example, to be 10% of the grade, I can multiply that times 0.1, and maybe each of my test grades is times 0.3, 30%, and then I also have my final grade. When you start to get expressions that are longer, although this one does fit within the window that we have, there is a button right here on the bottom right of where you enter the expression that has a ... You'll notice this actually in several places in DataGraph. There are these ... that we've been adding to fields where you can enter numerical values, but maybe it's a little bit short. So if I click this, you get a wider view here, so you can have much longer expressions. I'm sort of thinking maybe it would be nice for this to also have a slightly bigger font to make it easier to see. But for now, at least this gives you a much wider view. And again, any field where you see that ... you can click on that and you get a pop-up that gives you an expanded view where you can type, and then you can just click somewhere else and that pop-up will immediately fall down. So question, are the names case sensitive? And the answer is yes, they are case sensitive. So you do need to be aware of what the case is for them. So, okay, so here, basically, this is it. So we have our calculation. This would be here's our course grade that we have here for our final grade. Everything's weighted. So again, simple example, just to show you how we would do this first expression. And I guess another thing just to point out here too, is that, if you were just doing a summation in a spreadsheet, again, that is, for those of you who are used to doing that, it can be a pretty quick thing to do. But if you at any point need to move around any of the columns or want to reorganize things, then it's going to really cause problems, because here I can move this anywhere and it's not going to cause any issue. So if I decided I wanted the course grade first and then the final grade, or however I wanted to show this, I can go ahead and rearrange that, but it's not going to break my equation because I'm using the names of those columns. If, for example, I'm looking at this data and I want to really quickly say, so what was the average for everyone overall? You can just click the space bar and that immediately gives you a pop-up that has all sorts of statistics associated with that column of data. So here I have the average is shown here as 86.28 for the class. And so this is also a nice way to immediately see the whole distribution. So again, if you just wanted to get a quick view, you can click on a column, hold the space bar. I've been trying to show this to more people lately because I know not everyone knows that this is even here, and it's a very handy way to do this. In fact, if I then decide I want to move to look at a different column and see what those grade distributions look like, I can just use my arrows. So I clicked back on here and then just using my arrows to move between the different grades. Okay, so let's go to the next one, talk about this, because this is a case I'm sure people will run into, where we have here 3 test grades, but there's 1 grade now that is missing. When you have a place where, in a row, in a column like this, where you can see that, again, this is a missing point. There's no data there. The default within DataGraph is to ignore that row of data when doing calculations. So for example, here, first of all, I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to create an overall grade for these students, but I want to I want to drop one of these grades. So I want to calculate an overall grade. I have 3 test scores, and then I have 1 final, and I'm going to need to figure out how to drop that grade. So this is the first thing that so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use a function to do this, first of all. So this is our introducing our first function. So let me go ahead and add another expression here. And I'm going to identify what the lowest grade is for each of these students. And I guess the distinction that I want you to be very familiar with when using functions is that what functions do is they evaluate across a row of data. And one of the functions that we have is the ability to find the minimum within that row. So again, I can, and rather than typing each one of these in, I'm just going to copy and paste this here so this goes a little bit quicker. So here's my function, and this is a function, again, it's for finding the minimum. So I will say minimum, MIN, and then in brackets, I have each column where I'm finding the function within that row. So these are, it's looking at each discrete entry within that row, and you can have as many as you want here. And what you'll notice, so this is the grade that I want to drop, is that if I go back over now and look at this on the data table, in the row where there's a student who missed the first test, there's a blank shown here. Again, the default is that these empty fields are ignored. So what you need to do is go into your expression column and specify that what to do when there's missing data. There's a missing option. And here what we'll say is set to 0. And that means the 0 test grade when they weren't there is the one that's dropped. Now, of course, you could just have typed in a 0 here. But again, this is a common enough thing that happens where we just have missing data and we need to know how to handle that within our expressions. There is also the option here of setting missing values to a 1. I was trying to come up with a good example to show you why you would do that. I know there are times when I need to use that option, but I couldn't come up with a simple one just off, within as I was preparing for this. But basically, if you have numbers that you're multiplying by each other, then and you don't want to zero out everything, then setting a missing value to a 1 is a very handy thing to do, exactly for multiplication problems when you're doing multiplication. You also have the option of setting the missing values to a nan. And here you would not want to do that because then it just ignores this and is finding the wrong missing value. So for sure we want to set this in this case to a 0. So that gives us our dropped grade. And then in terms of calculating what the final is, we could then start with, let me do this first, start with, say, for example, we wanted our students to all know what their average test grade was as well. So we could type in test 1, 2, 3 minus whatever the dropped grade was, and then dividing that by 2. Again, we need the missing value set to 0. So now we have their average test grade. I'll give you a moment. Oh, there's a question about what is nan? Well, in some cases, it's, again, I guess I can't think of anything directly off the top of my head, but yeah, it means not a number. And there are, for example, if you're doing automated programming or you have some type of instrument, it's often, it's not unusual to have output that rather than showing just nothing, something has to be in a column as a placeholder. So programs will put in NaN to just say this is a, it's not a number, there's no value here, but it's a placeholder for something to be there. And DataGraph can recognizes when nans are entered. In normal operation, if you're entering the data, you wouldn't necessarily put in a nan, but it is not an uncommon thing in terms of working with data, particularly I think in my experience with using automated systems or doing calculations. If you are doing some computation in MATLAB and it's you're dividing by 0. I don't know if that gives you a nan or not, but that's maybe one example of something that could. Or someone actually just gave me a good example. The result of a negative root or a division by 0. That's another way to get a nan. It's not a number, it doesn't exist. Okay, so we did an expression to find the minimum value. We did another expression to then calculate the average test grade. And then we could do just one more expression where we calculated the overall course grade. And I'll actually just go from my example file here. And let's see, just paste that in. So here, so actually this is sort of useful to see. So I have another file that I've been working with where I had worked through these to prepare. And I literally took the object where I input this equation in my other DataGraph file. And I copied that object, I pasted it here, but you can see there's a little red dot up in the corner. This is indicating that there's an error. This is an expression object that has the name is test grade with a space in it. So when I was initially putting this together, that's what I named the column. So I'd just have to change that here to test, because that's what I called it within this file. And now I have my, let's see, my overall course grade over here on the right-hand side. And let me see, I know there was another question here. Oh, we're going to talk about the using absolute references. We'll talk about that, how we sort of handle that more as we continue. So let me see if there's anything more. I think this is basically it for this example. So mostly just showing you the use of a function. Here, just a simple function. It's checking across all the values within the rows that I've specified, just so you can see how these functions work too, and that it's not just within our expression field that I can use them. You can use them in other places also. So I think even, actually, I'm going to try this. I think this works. Yeah, so for example, here I input in my font the function minimum of 5 and 10 as my font. So it's picking 5. Now, this is maybe not something that would be that useful, but just again to illustrate, and then we make this much bigger. So here I'll put in my, or actually I'll change this to max, because that's another function that we have. So here within where you enter the number for the font, I stuck a max function in here, max of 50 versus 10. And that's picking the font now as 50, because that's the maximum of those two numbers. So you could also have variables here. This is what we'll talk about those as well. But anyway, that's maybe sort of an odd example, but just to show you, prove the point that I can use these functions everywhere where numbers are entered. I can use functions and do calculations. So in fact, before we do the next example, if I just want to put within a number column itself, so I created a new number column, and I did that by, if I did that quickly, I clicked Command 1 as a shortcut for creating a number column. So if I wanted to type into here, oops, I guess I didn't have that in my spreadsheet, the minimum of 2 and 4 and 6, then notice how it's not red, because if I type anything in a number column and it shows up as black, that means that it's working properly. But I could change the displayed value from what I entered to some number of digits, and now it's showing me the numerical value that's in this column. So again, the functions can even be used here within the number field itself. And I guess in case you didn't even realize that within these fields, you can do very simple math within the number column. But anyways, let me keep going, and I want to get to the next example that I have. But let's see. One question: is there a list of functions somewhere? This is a really easy thing actually to get to. If you click on the function object, expression column object, and you create an expression column, then right here on the gear menu, you can click that, and at the bottom there's a help button. In fact, every column type, command type, if you click the gear menu and then click on help, this will bring up for you the website, the knowledge base article for for the expression column. And if you want to go to the full function reference, then click here, and this will give you the full list. And they're also grouped a little bit. There's kind of sort of the main function list. There's the date and time functions. And then there's also, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail here at the moment. And then there's also some statistical functions. So you can look at that. And I think, I know there was a question about, is there a pop-up? I believe, let me see if I just type something in like this. Yeah, so if you are looking for just a quick pop-up to help prompt you for what the functions are, then you can just type it incorrectly. So here, for example, I typed in sine of 2. Now, this is not, since it's a constant, it's going to ask me, well, how many rows of this do you want? And maybe that's a little excessive. I could just say 2 rows. But if I deliberately type this incorrectly, for example, then you'll get a list of defined functions. And we've tried, I think, to keep this pretty much up to date. Hopefully we're not missing anything here, but this is a handy way to just get a quick list of all of the functions that are there, in terms of, if you just can't remember, how is this function typed. For example, I know I use the ceiling function all the time, and sometimes forget if it's the if it's the full name ceiling or just CEIL, and this shows me what that is. I guess another thing to recognize, there is also the little, I have a tendency to just click the gear menu and go to help, but you also do have this little question mark here that will also bring you to the knowledge base article. And from there, you can get to the function reference. You can also always just, if you search here within the knowledge base, this will give you the full function reference. In the next one, here we have a list of items that we are wanting to calculate up a budget. So say we have some, we're having a party and we just want to know, have we stayed within our budget for this party? And actually, I guess I also already did add in a variable down here called budget that has our total budget for this party. So if you haven't used variables before, this is the one mechanism for setting up a constant value, where instead of in a spreadsheet where you use, actually, I don't do this very often anymore, or really at all anymore. So I think it's the double dollar signs in order to say this is a single field, that I always want you to use that one field. Here we would set up a variable with a name and just enter in what the value is for that. So in that sense, it's the same as setting up a named cell within a spreadsheet. And so let me just show you quickly how to just add these. Again, there are these shortcut buttons that are up in this little mini toolbar here for different types of variables that we can add. The one that I have added here, called budget, is just a simple value type of variable, right? You just click this, you can click that shortcut, that adds the variable. We have to give it some name to take away the little red dot. And the names here do have to be unique. This is different than in the data table, where in the data table, you can have columns that have the same names. But one of the errors that we're trying to help avoid here is that if you set something as a constant, then it has to have a unique name. In that sense, these are what we would refer to as a global variable. So just like our other the functions, for example, that can be used in other places, these global variables not only are handy for doing calculations, but I could, for example, create a global variable for my font size, and then I could use that variable font over here as my font within my graph. So if I had multiple graphs that I all wanted to have the same font and easily be able to adjust them all at the same time, there are ways to have your, actually to quickly have the fonts extend to all your graphs within your file. But this is another option. You can set up your own variable for font, and you could have that change here. Okay, so let me get back to this option here for this budget example that we have. I guess the first thing that I wanted to show you is, or introduce you to, if you haven't used these before, is a column property. One of the things that people really frequently do within spreadsheets is they calculate a total, a running total, in a list of numbers. And I'm sure that many of you have done this technique before. You have a cell reference that uses the number above and then the number to the side, and you just copy that down. Your starting number is usually just itself. And so there's a little bit of a trick there. And here, since we don't refer to cell references in that way, the concept that was developed within DataGraph is to use this idea of a property of the column, where these various properties allow you to do these types of calculations. Again, I'm going to add an expression column. I'll do Command 3 to add that. Now I can see my entry box here. And the way that I would do this is to type in the name of my column, and then I type in a dot, and I only need one of them. I was trying to hold that so you could see what I was typing. And now I need to type in the name of this property, which I have a couple of them just memorized off the top of my head. It's not hard. And this property is called the I sum. It's the incremental running sum. So if you type or if you type the name of a column dot ISUM and hit enter, you get the incremental sum for that column. So again, and actually, I think I'll even just type it in here. This is dot ISUM so that you can see this. So I'm typing this right at the end of the name of the column, and now I'm getting my running sum, for example. So this is handy. It's just automatically calculating everything, giving me the total so I can see how much I've spent so far for each one of these items. And it's a handy thing. Now, what if I also wanted to know what the calculations were for the percentage of each one of these? And I see a couple of questions. I'm going to answer that in just a minute about pulling a specific value. So if I wanted to do the percentage, then what I would do here is, actually, I'm going to well, I'll just start again with a new expression. And to do this, I'm going to use another column property. And this column property is actually just even simpler than the ISUM. It's just the dot sum column property. The difference is that the dot sum column property is giving me a single number back. So some column properties will return an entire column. Other column properties return an individual number. So the dot sum is returning one specific value, the sum of a column, but then I can use that in an expression. So for example, here, if I type in amount, I just am returning the values for my column. But if I type in amount and then I divide that by amount.sum, now I have the fractional percentage that each one of these contributes to my overall budget. And if I wanted then to just multiply that by 100, now I get the percentage in percent units. And maybe I just really don't want to see the full amounts here. I just want to know approximately by dollar amount how much each one of these costs or percentage that they contribute. I could go ahead and round that. Now, actually, that will cause an issue because if you're rounding to 100, then if you round those and then you sum them, it's not going to sum up to 100, right? So actually, maybe that's not a good idea, but at least just showing you there is a function to round. So if I then again hit this column, press the space bar, this is also a really handy way to check that I've done this calculation correctly, because I can see right here on this graph, you can see that the sum of these numbers is 100, which is what we would want. Okay. Let's see what else I want to do here. So the question has come up. How do you grab the value from a specific cell? So say, for example, I wanted to know what everything costs relative to the cost of my venue. This is, my most expensive thing here. And to do that, you can refer to individual items by using parentheses with the column name. So let me go ahead and add another. Actually, I'll just use the same. I'll use the same one that we have here. So instead of creating a brand new expression, I can just copy and paste this object, or my favorite trick, hold the Option key, click and drag. I make my clone of this column. So this is going to be my, this will be relative to my venue, say, for example. And so I'm going to take my amount and I want to divide that by the amount that's in the second column. So I can say amount 2. And so that's all it is. So if you can see this here, I've done amount divided by the amount in the, sorry, not the second column, the second row. So this allows you to input the index of the row that you're interested in. And sure enough, if you look at the results here that come out of that equation, then you have the relative amount for venue is 1, which is what it should be because we're just dividing it by itself. So you can use the numerical value of the row in order to select a value, specify a value. Now, this is sort of a tricky thing to do, right? Because you are, you're not, what if you reordered these or something like that? That could be a problem for you. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as the most robust way. We can link data, and I can try and talk about that. That's because the question has come up about the using something like a VLOOKUP, and that's we have that functionality, but it's done obviously in a different way. We don't have a VLOOKUP type of a functionality at this moment. But I don't know, I really like the way that DataGraph handles those sorts of things. So first, let me see, what else do I want to do here? I think that this is pretty good for that example. Oh, actually, what I wanted to show you is one of the things that's really nice about DataGraph is not just the being able to do something like this calculation in my data table itself, but if I wanted to create a graphic that explained this data, then you could just do a simple bar graph, and that would show you the each one of these categories with the label given and the amount on the left-hand side. However, one thing that's really nice is that if you use the pivot command, then you can easily sort this. And if I go ahead then and I'll highlight my text column, highlight the amount, and click on pivot, now what the pivot command does by default, it will order everything down below according to the alphabetized order of these objects. But if you open up the pivot command, and there are ways to, actually, you can use this map rows in an instance like this in order to specify exactly the order that you want things to be in. But what I'm going to do here is change this from automatic to increasing. And then what it does is it has this mini table here that you see. This is it's really not, in this case, pivoting the data, if you're familiar with that term, but it does automatically order everything. So I find this to be very handy. And, again, rather than having to, if you needed an ordered list from this, rather than having to sort it in the spreadsheet, you can go ahead and just do that visually and have that visual representation of the data. So there is one question about, how are the features such as ISUM called in DataGraph a searchable keyword would help. So and we're definitely open to, coming up with better solutions than what we're doing now. But for now, if you, again, go in, my tip, it would be to go into the expression column, go to the help, and then within here, because these are just so related to the expression column and how we use expressions, there are links to the list of column properties that are on our website. And if you go to this list, then there's, again, that simple example of the percentage, and then you can see all the column properties that we have. So they're grouped according to the single values for column properties. So the min, the max, the length, range, and so on, and then multiple values. So if you need, again, a variety of different things, the ISUM is one of them. But there's a lot of cool ones here that are, it's almost worth just, setting aside some time and kind of playing with these, because you may not be aware that these are here. And like, for example, the total count, how many times does a value show up in a list? That's kind of an interesting thing to have as something that you can do very automatically. The maximum so far or the minimum so far, those are sort of interesting column properties. You can get the change between two values. This is the delta. Anyway, those are there for you to look at. So let me keep going through the examples that I have. And this is one where this is sort of inspired by an example that I saw online, where they had, okay, well, so what if you have these 3 individuals and they took some trip and they each contributed to the trip by purchasing different items along the way, and you need to know how much money each one of them owes. So let me get my example here set so that I can. So the first thing would be looking at just the total of, how much did each one contribute? So that's easy enough. We've done something like that already. And I'm just going to copy and paste this from my other file so you can see it. And also just show you again, if you have objects that with expressions from other files, you don't have to retype them. You can just select the object and copy and paste it, and you can go from file to file when you do that. So very handy. So here I have the total for all of these using the technique that we've seen before. But then in terms of how we would set up the ability for calculating how much does each one owe, well, I can actually do an expression for that as well. So hopefully you can kind of see how this is put together. So here I have the total column is in my expression, and I'm using the sum of the total. So this is all the money that was spent, and dividing that by 3. And then I'm taking this whole expression here and putting it in a function called round, again, to round this to the nearest dollar. So then I can see how much each person owes. So that's handy. But the other thing that I actually wanted to illustrate with this example, and let me go ahead and turn this off, is something that we talk about a lot within DataGraph. I'm always making a pitch for having data that's normalized. So the view that you see here, this is a very typical kind of a spreadsheet view of data, right? Where you have some category and you have these three columns. But what if I took this and I'm going to make a copy of this entire group, and instead of doing this calculation like this, I'm going to flatten this data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight my three columns where I have my values. I'm going to go under the data menu and I'm going to select flatten columns. So now you have a very different type of list, because we have the name as a category, or as a column, the category as a column, and then we have the value that was spent on each one of these items. And the benefit here is that then if I decided to go back and I realized, oh, wait, I also, spent some money on something that wasn't listed here. So I don't know, what did I buy? I bought, drinks for us. And I spent $20 on that. I can add that new category here. And if I have, actually, I guess I should really just illustrate this first with the graphic. Again, if I put this in the pivot command, and now I have each one of my people shown here. I can have a stacked view where I can see the total for each person in this graph. I actually don't have to see it by category if I want to see the total of what everyone has contributed. And then I could also add a label. So down below here, I can add the exact amount that everyone has contributed. And if I add new data or new categories, then these sums are still going to be calculated, and it's not going to affect my equations. Whereas here, this is going to require the addition of a new column in order to show this, to continue with this approach. Now, what I can do is I can extract this data, click on the gear menu, in case, again, for those of you who may not have done this before, any of the commands that perform calculations for you have the ability to extract that data back out into the data table. So here I'll click on the gear menu, I'll select extract all pivot columns, and now I have in my data table the same thing that I had when in the first version, right? Where I have this column of totals. I have a column of totals here, and they're in a different order since it's alphabetically ordered, but you can see again, the same numbers are calculated, but now I can add more. Well, they're not, because I added more information, but any new categories I add are now not going to cause any issue with my totals. My totals will be correct. And I can even take if I name this, let's just name this the same column name that I have here. I already have an expression that I set up to calculate how much someone owes based on a column called total, right? And this only uses the total. In fact, I can make this more general. I can have, this should be total dot, not capital, length, right? Because there's three people. So I had typed in the number 3 there. That actually was not making the best use of this. But this object that has this calculation in it, I can use that in my new columns that I've extracted. So what I usually do is I might put this in this group here as well. I might also put, actually, let me add a color to this. So if you have a group, you can click on the gear menu to create a different background color, make it a little easier to see the difference between the two. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this column where I'm calculating how much each one is owed, and I'm just going to copy and hold down the Option key, click and drag, and now that column is over here within my new group, showing how much everyone owes. And actually, maybe I can just zero out this this entry. So you can see that the numbers calculated here are the same as the values that are calculated here. So I use this, for example, when I have had trips and I've needed to calculate, what is my reimbursement from my travel. I don't put that in this type of a view. I have a list of, a category of what I'm spending on and a value, and then I use the pivoting in order to get the data in order to sum everything. So if I bring this back here, and then I'm going to extract all my pivot columns. So if you really needed to have, again, this type of a format where each category was a column, then you can still do that, but then you're just creating it on the fly and it's dynamic. So I also find that for something like this, I find it's less, for me, much less prone to errors. So if I'm trying to find my column and enter where things are, if I have a lot of different columns, if I'm instead doing it in this mode where I don't have to worry about putting things in the right column, I can just type in, what the value is for that category. And then I can still go over here and have that summary type of a view, so that I'm using this type of view more for my presentation, whereas the view that you see here is really more for the data entry if I'm entering data. So I know there's a question of the VLOOKUP, and I'd like to respond to that as we get beyond the noon hour. For those of you who can stick around, I'll continue to answer other questions that people have.